The order came at 6:14. Withdraw, all units. The civilian transit hub at grid reference Keth 79er Alpha was to be considered a total loss. The 9th Terran Expeditionary Rifle Company was to fall back to the Ridge Road and regroup at Firebase Orin before the Varan Compact's 2nd Artillery Wave arrived. Corporal Messon relayed it flat and fast, the way orders always sounded through a cracked earpiece. No inflection, no weight, just syllables pushed down a wire. Withdraw, all units. Senior Field Medic Torin Ashk was elbow-deep in a pressure dressing when the order arrived, his hands working on instinct, while the transit hub's outer wall shuddered from a near-miss 300 meters northeast. The soldier under his hands, Private Kara, 19 years old and bleeding from a laceration across her right thigh, where a fragment had punched clean through a supposedly reinforced doorframe, was watching the ceiling with the particular expression of someone doing the math on their own survival and not loving the numbers. "You're fine," Torin said. He said it the way he said everything in the field, as a statement of fact, not comfort. Comfort came after, fact came during. The distinction mattered. Comfort told a person what they wanted to hear. Fact told a person where the ground was. In his experience, people in actual trouble needed the ground more than they needed anything else. That order isn't about you right now. He pressed. She hissed. He held. Breathe. She breathed. He tied the final anchor, checked the color in her fingernails, found it acceptable, and sat back on his heels. The transit hub groaned around them. It had once been a junction platform for the Moon Civil Monorail, a long vaulted hall with high concrete arches and platform lips that now served as cover for the better part of a rifle company trying not to die. The monorail was scrap. The platforms were cratered. The arches were holding barely, on the sheer stubbornness of pre-war construction standards that no one had gotten around to cutting corners on before the Varan Compact made the question moot. There was a quality to the air in the transit hub that Torin had noticed on the first day and continued to notice every day since. The smell of old concrete dust and the distant chemical bite of propellant, and underneath both of those, something sweeter and harder to categorize that was the smell of the moon itself. The basalt rock, the trace mineral compounds in the thin atmosphere, the ghost of whatever ecosystem had once existed here before the mining operations had eaten it. It was not a good smell. It was, however, a real one, and he found that real smells helped him stay oriented. "Can you move?" he asked Kara. "Yes." "Good." He got her upright, handed her weight to Specialist Dunn, who was already moving toward the eastern corridor with 3 others in trail. "Fall back with Dunn. Don't run the south passage. The floor's gone soft from the drainage hit last night." "Understood." She went. Torin gathered his kit. He did it methodically, the way he'd been trained to do it, and had then retrained himself through the refinements of actual field use. Trauma dressings in order of size, left front pouch. Hemostatic agents, separate from the standard pack because you never wanted to be fumbling through a bag to distinguish them in poor light. Airway kit, right side. The small things, suture materials, antiseptic tabs, the folded laminated reference cards for alien physiological first aid that he was supposed to carry, and never used because the situations that needed them never looked like the situations described on laminated reference cards. In the inner left pocket. He was the last medic in this wing. The other 3, Yanda, Koss, and the newest one, Peril, who'd been in theater 4 weeks and still showed it in the way he held his shoulders when the incoming started, were already pulling back with the main element. His job now was to sweep the rearward rooms, any stragglers, any walking wounded who'd found a corner and lay down to rest and now couldn't get up again. Then he would follow the company east. He swept the first 2 rooms quickly. Empty, a third, used as an equipment cache, held a dead radio and a broken stretcher, nothing else. He came back to the main hall and stood there for a moment, doing the mental map of the hub's layout that he'd built over the 4 days they'd occupied this position. Main hall clear, North wing cleared with the rest of the company. East corridor the route out. South passage, compromised floor but cleared that morning. West annex, last checked at 5:30, held nothing but cabling and an old transit authority desk with a cracked top. And the platform level, the actual platform lips where the monorail had once docked. He began moving south, toward the platform lip, because it occurred to him that if anyone had tried to get below floor level they'd have gone down there, where the old maintenance crawlway ran under the platform decking. It was a natural instinct. When things got bad at ground level, people went down. He'd found a wounded soldier below a platform deck in Corin Station 2 years ago, a man who'd taken shrapnel in the hip and couldn't stand and had gone down through a maintenance access rather than stay in the open. He'd been there for 6 hours before Torin found him, alive, angry, and dehydrated. The platform edge was 40 meters south. He moved at a careful pace, watching the floor. The drainage hit from the night before had softened a section near the old fare barrier, and he'd marked it in his head, but it was worth confirming before he weighted his full body on it. He was almost at the edge when he heard it. Not an explosion, not the radio crackle of an order, not the particular clatter of debris settling after a near miss, which sounded different from an incoming round in ways he'd learned to feel in his sternum before he consciously processed them. A sound so incongruous, in the context of what surrounded it, that his brain needed a full 2 seconds to parse it. A small voice. High and uncertain, the way a child's voice got when it was very frightened but had learned very recently that crying made things worse. Thin, trying to be quiet. Failing, not failing entirely, but failing in the small, involuntary way that meant the effort to be quiet was costing something. Torin stopped. The artillery had paused a gap in the walking pattern, the way it always paused before repositioning. In the relative quiet of that gap, the sound was clear. Below him, beneath the platform decking. He looked down over the platform lip. In the maintenance trench below, a concrete channel roughly a meter wide and perhaps 2 meters deep, designed for cable access and drainage routing, not for shelter, never for shelter. A tiny alien girl sat with her knees drawn to her chest and her face pressed into them. She was no taller than his mid-thigh. Her skin was pale silver white, and even in the gray light filtering down from the shattered platform ceiling, he could see the faint constellation of blue bioluminescent markings scattered across her temples and along her cheekbones, not glowing, not now, which he would later understand meant she had gone far past frightened into something beyond it, a state where the body stopped broadcasting. Her hair was white, fine as cloud floss, matted with concrete dust that had settled into it until it was more gray than white. She wore what had once been a civilian transit worker's child-size reflective band, the orange kind that a parent put on a small one so they could find them in a crowd, but the clasp was broken and it hung half off one thin shoulder, which meant she'd probably been wearing it for days without anyone there to fix it. She was making that small, trying not to cry sound into her own knees, and the sound had a quality of patience to it. The patience of someone who had been making it for a long time and had learned that it didn't change anything, and who was making it anyway because some sounds were not decisions. They were just the truth of the body. Torin's radio crackled. Ashk, report status. All units should be in the eastern corridor. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the girl. She was Velnhai. He'd seen Velnhai civilians in the transit camps further west, a tall, spare people with silver or white skin tones that varied across a spectrum of gray and pale blue, and those bioluminescent markings that patterned down from their temples like watercolor brushstrokes, expressive in ways that the cultural briefing had touched on but hadn't fully explained. The children, he'd been told in that briefing, which he'd half absorbed between a casualty transport and a supply check, were small for a long time. They grew slowly in the first decade, and then quickly. This one looked approximately 4 or 5 by human developmental standards, maybe smaller. He wasn't certain. She was a very small person in a very large and very wrong situation. She had not yet seen him. The artillery began again, not close, not yet, but the approaching pattern was east to west, which meant it was walking toward this position. The withdrawal order had been timed against that pattern. He had perhaps 8 minutes before the next salvo reached this grid reference. He knew this not because he was calculating it, but because he had been in enough walking barrages to feel the timing the way you felt the rhythm of a long march in the body, not the mind. Ask the radio again, flat factual, confirm withdrawal. He keyed the channel, ask 1 minute. He dropped into the maintenance trench. The drop was less elegant than he'd have liked. The channel wasn't designed for a 6-foot human in full kit. It was designed for cable management systems and the narrow access trolleys that serviced them. And he landed badly on the left ankle, a sharp lateral wrench that he felt from the heel up through the knee, and he bit down on the noise that tried to come out of him, because the last thing he needed was to spook her further. She had heard him land. The sound of his boots hitting the concrete trench floor was not a small sound, and she had pressed herself into the far corner with her knees still up and her head down, going entirely still the way small creatures went still when they decided that movement was what made them visible. Her bioluminescent markings were completely dark. Even her breathing had gone shallow. He could see her back barely moving, the small frame doing everything it could to become less present in the space. The trench smelled of old drainage and concrete cold and something faintly biological, not unpleasant, not strong, the trace smell of a small person who had been living in a confined space for some time. He noted it the way he noted everything, not with judgment, with information. "Hey," Torrance said. He said it quietly. He was not, by nature, a soft-spoken man. He was a medic, and medics learn to project calm over noise, to be the loudest functional thing in a room full of loud, dysfunctional things. But he discovered at some point in the last 6 years that a different register existed for small, frightened people, and he developed it the same way he developed everything else useful in his professional life. By necessity, by repetition, by trial and error in bad situations where the stakes of a wrong calibration were high. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't move. He crouched down to her level, which with the kid on his back was awkward, and put his good knee on the damp concrete of the trench floor, and he kept his hands visible, flat, low, not reaching, not asking anything yet. He'd read the briefing materials on Velnhai nonverbal communication and retained approximately 15% of it, which in this moment amounted to: open hands meant no immediate threat. Eye contact was not automatically confrontational the way it was with some species whose territorial instincts were rooted through the eyes. And you did not make sudden large movements in the presence of someone who was already reading everything you did as data about danger. "My name is Torin," he said. He kept his voice at the same quiet, even register, not a performance of calm, the actual thing, which was something different. "I'm a medic. That means I'm the one who helps when people are hurt." She was still not looking at him. But her breathing had shifted. He could hear it in the quality of the quiet, the small change from held rigid to something else. The holding pattern of a held breath releasing, very slightly, because the voice it was responding to had not gotten louder or harder. "Are you hurt?" he asked. A pause that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then a tiny motion, almost invisible in the low light. Her head moved from side to side. "No." "Good," he said. "That's good." The artillery walked another step closer. The trench vibrated, not violently, a deep structural tremor, the kind that came from ground transmission rather than direct proximity. But it was still a tremor, and the girl flinched and pressed her knees tighter, and the sound she made, a single small, involuntary syllable, something between a gasp and a word, cut Torrance somewhere he had not been expecting to be cut. He had been in 8 active engagements over 6 years of field medicine. He had handled casualties in conditions that would have ended a less disciplined person's composure. He had been burned, concussed, shot at, buried under 2 feet of collapsed roofing material for 20 minutes while he waited for the structural situation to stabilize enough that he could move. He had made his hands steady and his voice level, and his mind operational when everything around him was coming apart, and he was good at it, and he needed to be good at it, and it was the thing he most reliably was. The sound she made reached right past all of that and landed somewhere older, not the medic part, the other part, the part that had been a child once and remembered it and had not found a way to be entirely professional about the suffering of very small people and had stopped trying. "I know," he said. "I know it's loud, I know it's scary." He paused, not a hesitation, a breath, a giving of space. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay? I just need you to let me pick you up." He waited. The radio crackled again. This time it was Lieutenant Savar's voice, which meant the situation had escalated past the point where corporals were managing it and had arrived at the point where Savar herself was managing it. "Ashk, what is your status? We are 60 seconds from losing your corridor." Torin kept his eyes on the girl. "I have a civilian casualty," he said into the radio, which was not technically inaccurate. She was a civilian, she was here, and he was about to carry her out. "In recovery, hold the eastern access point." A pause on the other end. Savar doing the math. Then Savar, with the particular flatness of a commanding officer who had already made the calculations and was communicating the result of them. "You have 3 minutes before we cannot hold that access point. Do you understand?" "Understood." He put the radio down and looked at the girl. She had in the last 30 seconds turned her head slightly. Not toward him, still mostly away, mostly toward the corner, but the angle had changed by perhaps 20 degrees. She was, he thought, listening to something in his voice. Not the words, the frequency, the pattern. The thing underneath both of those, the thing that voices did when they were telling the truth about what they intended versus when they were managing a situation. She had been in this trench for, based on what he'd been told and what she looked like, something approaching 3 days, and in that time she had listened to a great deal of noise, and none of it had been safe, and she was using whatever she had left to decide if this was different. He kept his hands open. He kept his voice at the same register. He did not fill the silence unnecessarily. It held. "My name is Torin," he said again. "I'm going to get you out. I just need you to let me." Very slowly he moved his hand toward her, not grasping, not claiming, just present, open, within her reach if she chose it. The difference mattered. He was not reaching for her. He was making himself available. She looked at his hand. He waited. Her bioluminescent markings flickered, the first movement of light he'd seen from her, a dim and uncertain pulse along her right temple, the color of shallow seawater catching a low sun, blue-green and wavering. Then, in a motion so deliberate it almost looked adult, she unfolded one small arm from around her knees and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, they gripped very hard. Torin exhaled, not relief, not yet, because there was no time for relief, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. That was the thought that stayed with him as he cleared the platform lip with her in his arms, her face turned into his shoulder, and her grip on the front of his vest, so tight he could feel it through the ceramic plate underneath. She weighed almost nothing, and the weight of her was the heaviest thing he had carried in this or any other engagement. Not in the physical sense. In the other sense, the one that had no technical language in his field manual. He moved fast, fast as his wrenched ankle allowed, which was faster than it should have been but not as fast as he wanted. The eastern corridor was 300 meters of broken floor, low archways, and 2 turns, the second of which required a near crawl under a collapsed beam that had wedged between the ceiling and a platform column at roughly chest height. He'd passed it twice earlier and cleared it easily with a slight duck. With her in his arms, he recalculated the angle on the move and decided to go under on his knees rather than risk losing his grip on her. The concrete was cold and wet under his knees. He kept her held up and clear and came through on the other side without incident, which was more than he'd hoped for. She made no noise during it. None at all. Not during the beam, not when his wrenched ankle took an uneven step in the dark and he lurched sideways and had to catch the wall with his free hand. Not when the second artillery salvo hit to the northeast and the corridor wall shed a fine, continuous rain of concrete powder over both of them that whitened his kit and settled in her hair. She tucked herself against him with a completeness of trust that he would not understand until much later, when he had time to sit with it. She had, in the space of 1 minute in a dark trench, decided he was safe, and she had committed to that decision entirely. She had done the calculation once and she was not running it again. She was just here, and he was the here she decided to be in. He came out of the corridor into the gray light of the hillside. 4 soldiers at the access point, rifles oriented outward, in the posture of a group maintaining a position, while also being very ready to stop maintaining it. Savar, compact, brown-skinned, the specific quality of tired that was not acute exhaustion, but the chronic version that came from being responsible for things over a long time, looked at him, and then looked at the child in his arms. She made no immediate remark, which told him she was doing rapid triage of the situation. Behind her, Specialist Dunn had his rifle up on the ridgeline. Private Kara was sitting against the wall with her bandaged leg extended, looking up with the expression of someone who had done the original survival math and was now doing a revised calculation that was coming out better than expected. She was in the maintenance trench under the south platform, Torin said to Savar, keeping his voice at report level, clear, factual, no editorializing. Don't know exactly how long. She's not injured by immediate assessment. Velnhai child, approximately 4 to 5 years. Savar looked at the girl. The girl was still tucked into Torin's shoulder, face not quite hidden but not quite fully showing, watching Savar with those pale violet eyes that didn't miss much. Savar's expression was not cold. She was not a cold person, whatever else she was, but it was careful in the way command-level expressions got careful when operational complexity was added to in an environment that was already at full complexity. Velnhai civilian sector is at the Orin camp, Savar said. There's a liaison there. I know. She come willingly. Torin considered the question. In operational terms, it was a meaningful question. It touched on rules of engagement, on the distinction between rescue and removal. She took my hand, he said, which was not the full answer in operational terms but was the truest one in every other sense. Savar held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once. Move. The ridge road to Firebase Orin was 3 kilometers of ground-level track cut into the basalt hillside. A surface road that the engineering company had blasted and graded in the first week of the occupation. Rough enough that boots were preferable to vehicles unless you had armor, smooth enough that a squad at combat pace could cover it in under 40 minutes. They did it in 32, because the artillery pattern had shifted northeast, and the company's read on the incoming trajectory had been accurate enough that being 3 kilometers east felt considerably better than being where they'd been. The girl, he still didn't know her name. She had not spoken, stayed in his arms the entire march. She'd shifted position slightly after the first 10 minutes, less the full-body tuck of someone in immediate shock, more the particular settled weight of a small person who had found where they were going to be for the foreseeable future and had arranged themselves accordingly. She watched the ridgeline go past with her large, pale violet eyes fully open and intent. She was taking everything in. He could feel it in the quality of her attention, not the blank, shut-down stare of a traumatized child who had disengaged from processing, but something more active than that. Cataloging, recording, comparing what she saw against whatever internal map she was building of this unfamiliar situation. At some point, perhaps 20 minutes into the march, she made a small sound. He glanced down. She was looking at his chest, specifically at the medical cross patch on his vest, which was Terran's standard issue, a white cross on a red background, waterproof and high visibility, the universal identifier. She had apparently been examining it for some time and had now reached some conclusion about it. "That tells people I help when they're hurt," he said. It was, more or less, what he'd told her in the trench, but cleaner now, without the urgency. He thought she might be ready to receive it properly. Her eyes moved up to his face. They were remarkable eyes of pale violet iris, the pupil very dark, with almost no dilation adjustment in the ambient light, which was unusual, and which he filed for later consideration as possible Wellenhigh physiological normal rather than sign of neurological compromise. She held his gaze for a moment with a gravity that seemed too large for a face that size. A child's face with old attention behind it. Then she made a word. He didn't catch all of it, it was Wellenhigh, and his Wellenhigh was limited to the 15% of the briefing that had stuck, but the sound had shape to it, 2 syllables, soft consonants, the vowels round and forward. Something like asterisk issy asterisk. A name. Her name, he thought, offered the way you offered a name when you wanted someone to have it. "What was that?" he asked. She said it again slower, "Issy." "Issy," he said. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed, a quick, warm flicker, both temples at once, the same blue-green as before but noticeably brighter. The equivalent, he would eventually learn, of a small and cautious smile. "Issy," he said again, confirming, and then, "I'm Torin." She looked at him with those steady violet eyes. Then she said, with the careful exactness of a child setting a new word down with both hands, "Torin." 2 syllables, equal weight, as if she were giving each one the same careful attention. He didn't have a category for how it felt to hear it, not professionally, not operationally. He just noted it, the way he noted everything useful, and kept walking. For the rest of the march neither of them said anything, but at some point, he couldn't have named when it happened, the quality of the silence between them changed from the silence of 2 strangers sharing a space to something else, something that didn't have a field manual entry. The basalt hills went past. The sky above Arva's Keth was the color of old pewter, uniform and low, the kind of sky that had weather in it somewhere but wasn't showing it yet. The company moved in the ordered quiet of a unit that knew how to be quiet when it needed to be and why. And Issy watched it all with her cataloging attention and her markings doing their slow, returning pulse, and gradually, very gradually, the way a light comes up, they brightened. Firebase Orin sat against the eastern face of the ridge, in a hollow that the terrain shaped into something almost defensible by accident of geography. It was a forward operating base in the pragmatic sense, assembled fast with prefab components, organized around function rather than comfort, fortified to the standard that stopped what needed to be stopped and not a unit more. Habitat modules in 3 rows, staggered for fragmentation separation. A medical wing in a converted cargo container, better than it sounded, with proper lighting and a real sterilization unit, and enough supply to handle a moderate engagement's casualty load before resupply. A comms tower. A perimeter of reactive fencing that hummed at a frequency that was above human hearing and was apparently audible to several local fauna species, which had caused an incident on day 4 that Torin had dealt with and did not particularly want to deal with again. At the northeast edge of the compound, a cluster of gray modular shelters served as the Wellenhigh civilian staging area. 312 people, by the count he'd been given in the briefing 2 weeks ago, evacuated from the transit zones to the west before the Varan Compact's forces had collapsed the ceasefire, waiting with varying degrees of patience for processing through to the safe zone relocation camps. They had their own water point, their own food supply in a configuration that met Wellenhigh dietary requirements, and their own liaison officer who managed the relationship between them and the Firebase command structure. Torin carried Issy through the main gate with the rest of the company. She had been watching the approach carefully. The fencing, the height of the comms tower, the other soldiers moving through the compound on their own business, the sounds of a functioning military installation. And when the Velnhai section came into view, she went very still. Her markings lit. Not the dim, uncertain flicker of the trench or the careful pulse of the march. A full, warm blaze both temples, along the lines of her cheekbones, down to the edge of her jaw, blue-green that was almost teal at its brightest, the color of deep seawater in good light. Her whole body changed, the held-in quality replaced by something released. She made a sound she hadn't made before, a high, involuntary two-note syllable, urgent and entirely without the careful quietness she'd been holding, and she turned her whole body in his arms toward the Velnhai shelters. "Is someone in there?" he asked. The question was unnecessary. The answer was written on every lit centimeter of her face. He changed direction. The Velnhai civilian liaison officer was a woman named Vel Sarath. Torin had encountered her twice in his 3 weeks at Firebase Orin, once at the gate, once in the medical wing, when one of the Velnhai civilians had needed treatment that crossed the boundary of what Vel Sarath could manage with her own supplies. Both encounters had been efficient, professional, and notably not warm. He'd understood that too. The Velnhai civilians in the camp had not had an easy 3 weeks, and the relationship between Velnhai civilian authority and Terran military presence in the Keth corridor was a relationship with a complicated history. Vel Sarath's composure was the composure of someone managing many things while trusting none of them to stay managed. She was tall, composed, with gray-silver skin and extensive bioluminescent markings. Not the young, bright lines of Issy's face, but the settled architecture of decades. Her markings had been fully expressed for years, and now had the quality of permanent features rather than active communication, though they moved when she needed them to. She was standing outside the forward shelter with a date aslate when Torin came around the corner of the eastern row, and she looked at the child in his arms, and something in her controlled expression fractured. Not broke, fractured, a controlled thing developing a crack in a specific place under a specific force. "Issy Velner Wrath," she said. It was not a question. The girl, Issy, went completely rigid for exactly 1 second, the way a person did when they heard their full name said by someone who knew them. Then she was reaching both arms toward the liaison officer with an urgency that nearly unbalanced Torin, and he transferred her across quickly, not gracefully but safely, and Vel Sarath caught her. Held her. The liaison officer's markings were blazing different pattern from Issy's, adult-shaped, lines running from temples to collarbone, and along the insides of her forearms in a pattern that must have been her own, unique to her, unmistakably in the same genus of response as what Torin had seen from Issy in the trench and on the march. Relief, fierce and total, expressed by a biology that didn't bother with understatement. Torin stood back. He was watching, but not in a field context. He was watching in the way of someone seeing something complete itself, a circuit closing, a shape finding its end. Issy was talking against Vel Sarath's shoulder, words tumbling over each other in Velnhai, not the careful 2-syllable efforts she'd made with Torin, but the full fluency of a child speaking in her own language to someone who knew it, could hold it, would not need her to slow down or simplify. Her markings were blazing full. Her hands were fisted in the back of Vel Sarath's jacket. Vel Sarath listened and responded and held on. Her face was against the top of Issy's cloud-floss hair, and her eyes were closed, and she was saying something soft and continuous that Torin couldn't hear clearly and didn't try to. He gave them time. After perhaps 2 minutes, Vel Sarath looked up at him over Issy's head. Her expression had changed from what it usually was. The calibrating quality was still there, but what it was calibrating had changed. She was measuring something new. "She says you found her under the floor," the liaison officer said. Her Terran standard was clean, only a slight rhythmic difference in the vowels, the cadence of a language that organized itself around different stresses. In a maintenance trench under the transit platform at Keth 79er Alpha, Torin said. South platform, under the lip. I was sweeping the rearward area during the withdrawal. She was there from the evacuation, Velsarath said. Her voice was level, but something moved through her markings as she said it, a brief, dark ripple that passed from her temples to her collarbone and back, the expression of a contained and private grief moving through a contained and professional person. We lost her 3 days ago, in the crowd at the junction platform. 3 days. She wasn't injured, Torin said. No obvious contusions, no sign of fracture, no notable pupil asymmetry, though I don't have Velnhai baseline, so I was working by internal comparison. She should be seen properly. She may be dehydrated. I didn't have anything to give her on the march. I don't know Velnhai dietary specifics well enough to know if standard field rations would have been appropriate. Velsarath looked at him. She looked at him in a way she hadn't looked at him before. She said, Velsarath said, that you told her what the mark on your chest meant. I did. She said you spoke quietly. He didn't know what to say to that. It seemed appropriate, he said. Velsarath was quiet for a moment. Issy had gone still against her shoulder, still holding on, but the urgency had settled into something more like residents staying, rather than arriving. Her markings were still lit, but they'd shifted from the blazing, released brightness of the first moment to something steadier and warmer. Her grandmother is here, Velsarath said. She was notified this morning that we had no reasonable expectation of locating Issy. She has been in the shelter since. A pause, calibrated. I will go to her now. I understand, Torin said. He started to turn. Medic. He looked back. Issy had turned her head and was looking at him directly. Her pale violet eyes were steady. Her markings were blazing full. She said his name, Torin, in the same careful 2 equal syllables. And then she said something else, a full sentence in Velnhai, addressed to him. Velsarath translated without inflection. She says, you stayed in the loud place even when everyone else left. Torin looked at the girl. He thought about the right answer to that and came up with the most accurate one he had. Someone had to check, he said. Issy received the translation. She held his gaze for another moment, her markings warm and full. Then she turned back into Velsarath's shoulder. Torin turned and walked to the medical wing to deal with his ankle. He was still there an hour later, ice pack applied. A wrap job done by his own hands because Medic Yanda had a full board ahead of her, and he was not going to add himself to it over a sprain, when the shelter door opened and Specialist Dunn leaned in. Liaison's asking for you, Dunn said. The Velnhai one. Torin looked up from the wrap. Now. She said when you're able, but the way she said it I think she means now. He went. Velsarath was outside the forward civilian shelter, in the narrow path between the modules. She had her data slate, but she wasn't looking at it. She was waiting the way someone waited when they'd made a decision and were implementing it. Her grandmother, she said without preamble, Elder Velnarath, she wants to speak with you. I can come now, Torin said. Good, but she didn't move immediately. She stood there for a moment with the data slate in her hands, and something in her expression was working through something. You went back, she said. Not an accusation, not a question, more like something she was checking against her own model of how things worked. She was there, Torin said. The order was to withdraw. The order was to withdraw all units. She wasn't a unit. Velsarath looked at him. The calibrating quality in her expression had developed into something more. She was not recalibrating any longer. She had arrived somewhere. He couldn't read exactly where. 3 days, she said. In a trench under an active engagement zone. Many of our adults would have found that extremely difficult. A pause. She is 4 years old. She was managing, Torrens said. She was scared and she was in pain and she was managing. She'd learned to be quiet when quiet was what was needed. She was still watching everything. Vel-Sareth absorbed that. She described you as the man with the healer's mark who explained what it meant. A pause. She said you did not flinch. I did on the inside, Torrens said. I just don't let it reach my hands. It was not meant to be interesting. It was just what he did and why. But Vel-Sareth's expression shifted again. A small movement, difficult to read, but warmer than anything she'd directed at him before in 3 weeks of professional acquaintance. The grandmother's shelter is the third in the east row, she said. Elder Vel-Narath received him seated. Vel-Sareth had explained on the short walk over that this was not a discourtesy. The elder was old enough that standing for an extended meeting was an unnecessary expenditure of something she'd rather keep for more important uses, and that her title was elder, not by rank in the administrative sense but by age-class recognition, which in Velnhai society carried a distinct kind of authority, the kind that wasn't granted by anyone, the kind you accumulated. She was small by Velnhai standards, and ancient by any of them. Her skin was deep silver gray, and her bioluminescent markings had the settled, permanent quality of very old lines that had been fully expressed for decades, not moving constantly as younger Velnhai markings moved, but shifting with intent, with purpose, the way old features moved when they'd earned the right to be economical. They ran from her temples down her neck and along the backs of her hands in patterns that he found, for reasons he couldn't articulate, beautiful in the same way that old architecture was beautiful, not for newness but for duration, for everything implied by the fact that they were still there. She had the same pale violet eyes as Issy. That was the first thing he noticed. Decades of difference in everything else, but the eyes were the same quality of attention, the same pale color with its absence of dilation. He understood, looking at them, where Issy's gravity had come from. Issy was beside the elder on the sleeping mat, curled in the particular complete way of a small child who had found the safe place they were looking for and intended to stay in it indefinitely. She was asleep. Her markings were quiet, dim, slow, rhythmic pulses, the biological cadence of a deep and untroubled rest, like the signal of something functional and settled. Her cloud floss hair was spread across the elder's knee. One of the elder's hands was resting, very lightly, on the top of the child's head. Torrens sat across from the elder, with Vel-Sareth beside him to translate. Elder Vel-Narath looked at him for a long moment before she spoke, not assessing him in the way of tactical assessment, not looking for threat or weakness, looking for something else, something that took longer and used different instruments. Then she said, through Vel-Sareth, "Tell me what you saw when you found her." So he told her. He told her about the maintenance trench and the sound he'd heard in the gap between artillery strikes, and the way the sound had been trying to be nothing, but wasn't quite managing it. He told her about dropping into the trench and landing badly on the ankle, and the way Issy had pressed herself into the corner without making a large sound. He told her about the open hands and the waiting, and about the way Issy had listened to something under his voice before she'd looked at him. He told her about the hand, the small cold fingers and the decision they'd represented. He told her about carrying her through the corridor, and the way she'd stayed completely still during the beam and the bad step and the concrete dust, and the way her markings had come back while they walked. Elder Vel-Narath listened without interrupting. Her own markings moved while he spoke, slowly, in patterns he couldn't read but whose movement had a quality he associated, by some instinct he hadn't learned and couldn't source, with memory, with the processing of something that touched old things. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Issy breathed on the mat, slow and even fully asleep. "She told me," the elder said finally through Vel-Sareth, "that you have a healer's mark on your chest, and that when she asked about it, you explained what it meant." "I did." "And that when the loud sounds came, you held steady." "That's my job," Torrens said, To hold steady when it's loud. Yes, the elder said, but she said you held steady for her. She did not say you held steady because of your job. She noticed the difference. Torin didn't have an answer for that. He sat with it. She is not a simple child, the elder continued, and the way she said it through Vel-Sareth's translation, but the weight was clearly the elder's weight, was not boastful, just true. She observes carefully. She makes distinctions that children her age do not usually make. A pause. She was in that trench for 3 days. Do you know what she said about it when I asked her? He waited. She said she was afraid, and then she said that she learned in the trench that she could be afraid and still watch everything. She said she practiced. A pause. She is 4 years old. The weight of that landed on him, the way weights landed when you weren't ready for them. She made the right calculations, he said finally. She stayed in place, she stayed quiet, she stayed alive, all the right calls. He paused, and then she took my hand. The elder looked at him with her deep pale eyes for a long time. Then she said something longer, 4 or 5 sentences, and Vel-Sareth translated carefully. She says, there is a quality a person can have that our people call *Vel-Sareth. You will notice this is the same root as my own name, which I mention not for vanity, but because the name was given to me for this reason. A pause in the translation. The quality is the capacity to hear what is being buried under silence, to notice the sound that is trying not to be made. Among our people it is considered one of the oldest gifts because it is the gift that kept children alive in the first days, when the world was harder than it is now. The ability to hear the hidden cry. Another pause. She says, not many have it. It cannot be trained into a person who does not carry it. She says she heard it in how you described what you found, not a child in a trench *, but the specific sound and the specific quality of the silence around the sound, the specific choosing of the word * managing. A pause. She says, you have * Vel-Sareth *. This is not a small thing to say. Torin sat with that. How long will she be in the camp? He asked finally. Issy and the elder. Processing for relocation takes 2 to 3 days, Vel-Sareth said, in her own capacity now, not translating. There is a safe zone community to the west. Elder Vel-Nerath has family there. They will be comfortable. Good, Torin said. He meant it simply and entirely. The way he meant everything he said, that was also true. He did not expect to see Issy again before the relocation. The medical wing kept him occupied through the rest of that day and into the night. The accumulated cost of the engagement, distributed across 14 soldiers with varying degrees of damage that all required hands and time and materials. He moved through it as he always moved through it, methodical, present, factual. Kara's dressing checked at 1800 and found satisfactory. A suspected mild concussion in Sergeant Perrin assessed and monitored. A cut to the hand from debris on the ridge road, deeper than it looked, requiring 2 sutures and an antiseptic flush. Minor things. The kind of minor things that could become significant things if nobody bothered to be the person who checked. At 2100, he went outside for 10 minutes because he'd learned that 10 minutes outside at some point in a long shift was the maintenance that kept the rest of the shift from degrading. The basalt hillside was dark and clear, and the sky above Arva's Keth showed the distant, patient flicker of orbital traffic, supply transports probably, making their runs while the surface stayed relatively quiet. The artillery had been silent for 7 hours. He didn't trust it, but he sat with the silence anyway, because silence that was real and silence that was tactical pause felt different, and this felt real. He heard the footstep before he saw her. Small light. On the gravel path between the medical wing and the habitat row, not entirely confident of the surface, each step placed with the care of someone who was operating in a space they hadn't mapped yet. He turned. Issy was standing 4 meters away in the dark, wearing a Velnhai civilian wrap that was several sizes too large for her, long enough that it pooled slightly around her feet, which explained the careful stepping, with her cloud floss hair loose around her face. She had a small object in both hands, a flat, smooth disc, perhaps 8 centimeters across, that caught the orbital traffic glow in a way that suggested polished stone or synthetic glass. She was holding it out toward him in both hands, the formal way, the presenting way. Her markings were lit, warm and steady, both temples and along her cheeks, the blue-green that he had come to think of as her particular color, the color that meant she was present and she was certain, and she was not afraid. He crouched down to her level. She crossed the 4 meters between them with her careful, each step placed gravity, stopped in front of him, and placed the disc in his outstretched hands. He looked at it, smooth, pale, with a faint iridescence even in the dark. He thought it might be Velnhai clouded silicate, a semi-precious material he'd seen worked into objects in the civilian shelters, though he didn't know enough to be certain. It was warm from her hands, the specific warmth of something that had been held for a long time. "Did Vel-Sareth tell you it's okay to be out here?" he asked. She said Tor-Ren, same 2 syllables, same equal weight, and then something else in Velnhai. Then, with careful exactness, a single Terran standard word that she had clearly been preparing. "Here," she said. He looked at her. "Here." She pointed to the disc, then to his chest, not at the medical patch this time, at his sternum, at the place where the chest sounded when someone put a hand flat against it and you breathed. He understood, or came as close to understanding as he was going to manage, what she was trying to say. The thing the Elder had called *Vel-Sareth*, the disc as a marker of it, the word asterisk here as the Terran standard word she'd found for the thing the Elder had described. His throat did something he hadn't been prepared for it to do. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he said the things that were true and mattered, simply, without performance, with the full weight of the meaning behind it. She held his gaze for a long moment, her markings steady and warm, and then she leaned forward, the motion entirely different from the careful adult gravity of everything else she did, entirely child, and pressed her forehead briefly against his. The warmth of it, the smallness of her forehead, the total, uncomplicated confidence of the gesture. Then she turned and walked back toward the Elder's shelter with her careful each-step gait, the oversized wrap trailing slightly in the gravel, and disappeared through the door. Torrin stayed where he was for a long time. He held the disc in both hands. It was still warm. The formal acknowledgement came the next morning, which he had not anticipated. He was in the company mess with a protein block and a cup of something that was allegedly grain when Vel-Sareth appeared in the doorway with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew exactly who they were looking for and had found them. "Elder Vel-Narath requests your presence," she said. "It is a formal matter." He went. The larger of the 2 Velnhai community shelters was arranged differently than he'd seen it before. The tables had been moved to the edges. The central floor was clear. Elder Vel-Narath sat in the middle, on a low seat that one of the civilians had brought for her, and she was not alone. 6 other Velnhai adults stood in a loose half-circle behind her, all of them with their markings in the particular state of active, deliberate expression. Witnesses, Torrin understood. This had been arranged for them. Lieutenant Savar was also present, standing to one side, in the controlled posture of a commanding officer who has been briefed on a situation and has decided that the correct response is to observe it. She caught his eye briefly and gave him the small nod of a person saying, "This is yours, not mine." Issy was not there. Vel-Sareth took her position beside the Elder and straightened her spine, and the quality of her attention shifted into something more formal. The liaison mode, the translating mode, the mode in which she was most accurately the voice of someone else. Elder Vel-Narath spoke. "Among our people," Vel-Sareth translated, "there are obligations that exist outside the law and outside the authority of any state or compact or military order. They are older than those structures and they outlast them. One of these obligations is the obligation of naming. She paused in the translation to let it land. When a person does for a child what the child's family could not do when they stand in the place of protection at the moment when the family is absent, that person is given a name in the child's family line. The name is a recognition. It says, "You were here, you heard, you did not leave." Torin kept his expression level, which was easier than he'd thought because what he was feeling was not the kind of emotion that showed as expression. It was the kind that went somewhere quieter and deeper. "This is not a legal claim," the elder continued. "It does not alter your name or your obligations or your identity. It is a mark, a true mark. Among our people, once given, it cannot be taken back." A pause. "I ask whether you are willing to receive it." He thought about the maintenance trench, the small sound trying not to be a cry, the hand, the disc which was in his kit pocket, which had still been warm when he'd put it there the night before. "Yes," he said. The elder spoke. 8 syllables, formal in register, shaped the way words were shaped when they'd been said the same way across generations. The Velnhai adults behind her shifted their markings in unison, a quiet, collective pulse, the biological equivalent of bearing witness. Then Vel Sarath translated. "You are asterisk Veltorin asterisk to Isi Vel Narath." In the nearest translation, the one who heard her when the world was loud. Behind him, Savor made no sound. The witnesses stood with their markings in slow, settled movement, not celebration, not grief, something more durable than either. Something that said, "This happened and we saw it, and now it is recorded in the kind of record that doesn't require paper." Torin said, "Thank you." He meant it as a statement of fact, which was how he meant everything true. The gratitude was real. The weight of what had been handed to him was real. He was not going to perform it. The elder said something brief and Vel Sarath translated. She says, "You have the quality. Not many do. She is glad her grandchild found you and not someone else." He saw Issy once more before the transport came. The humanitarian carrier arrived mid-morning, white-hulled, slow, one of the Terran Expeditionary Accord's civilian fleet. The Firebase Medical Wing had been asked to do final wellness checks on all departing Velnhai civilians under the age of 12, which was 5 children total, of which Issy was the last. She came in with Elder Velnarath's hand in hers, walking with her careful step-by-step gravity, wearing a clean civilian wrap that fit her properly this time. When she saw Torin, she stopped, looked at him, then walked straight to him and stood in front of him with her markings lit and her violet eyes steady, and waited. He did the check properly. Pulse, which was regular and slightly elevated above human baseline in a way he now knew was Velnhai child normal. Eyes both clear, symmetrically responsive, the pale iris uniform, skin temperature normal, hydration fully recovered. He told her as he noted each finding what it meant. Not because he thought she needed it, he thought she understood most of it, but because he'd told her what his patch meant, and he was going to continue being the person who explained things. She listened with her full attention, the cataloging attention he'd first seen in the trench and had watched ever since. When he said, "You're well," she nodded once, with the deliberateness of a much older person receiving a report. He gave her a clean Terran medical cross patch, a small one from the pediatric supply stock, meant to go on a child's kit, because she had looked at the one on his vest twice during the examination, and he thought she understood what it meant, and he thought she should have one. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Her markings brightened, the full, warm blaze. She turned the patch over in her fingers, examining both sides. Then she looked up at him and said very carefully in Terran standard, "Torin, here." It was the same thing she'd said the night before with the disc. A repeat that wasn't a repeat, it was a confirmation. A fixing of the word to the person, so it wouldn't get lost. "Safe travels, Issy," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, her markings lit full, and then she turned and took the elder's hand and walked out of the medical wing into the compound light. He listened to the transport's engines cycle up through the hull of the container. He stayed where he was, at the examination station, with the medical bay sounds around him. The hum of the sterilizer unit, the soft beep of the monitoring equipment, the distant radio traffic of the firebase going about its business. Outside, the transport rose. He could feel the change in the vibration of the ground, the specific frequency of a mid-size carrier achieving lift. He thought about a word that had no Terran standard equivalent, the one who heard her when the world was loud. He had been in 8 active engagements, and he had always known what the job was, and the job was always the same job. Hold steady, keep your hands from shaking, check the rooms. The job did not distinguish between categories of what it found. The job was to go back. He'd always understood that. What Issy had given him, in the disc, in the word, in the 2 syllables of his name set down like something worth keeping, was the understanding that the job had, this once, been noticed by the person it was for. Not by a command structure, not by a citation, not by any apparatus that dealt in recognitions as formal currency. By a 4-year-old in a concrete trench who had been paying very careful attention. He reached into his kit pocket and took out the disc. Still warm. Always warm, it seemed like. The polished silicate held temperature the way certain materials held it, not because of the material's own heat, but because it had been touched by living hands and retained the memory of that. He held it for a moment, there in the med bay. Then he put it back and went to work, which was what he did, and which, for the first time in a while, felt like something he was doing for reasons he'd actually verified. The firebase went on around him. Outside the transport was a sound thinning toward nothing in the pewter sky. He noted that too, the way he noted everything, factually, completely, with both hands. And